You're destroying the only proof I came here to save this bank." The words settled into the air with a strange calm that didn't belong in a room filled with polished marble, expensive suits, and the soft hum of computers processing millions of dollars every day. For half a second, nobody moved. Then Richard Whitmore laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was worse. The kind that came from a man so certain of his own judgment that he couldn't imagine being wrong. Standing behind the executive counter of First Southern Bank in downtown Atlanta, Richard adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit and glanced at the elderly black man standing across from him. Dust clung to the man's worn brown boots. Faint traces of red Georgia clay stained the cuffs of his faded jeans. His plaid work shirt looked decades old, softened by years of washing and long days beneath the southern sun. Nothing about him matched the sleek surroundings of the bank's flagship branch. Nothing except the check resting in Richard's hand. $2 million. Richard held it between two fingers as though it were contaminated. Several customers waiting nearby had already begun watching. A young teller froze midway through counting a stack of bills. An investment advisor stopped typing. Even the security guard near the entrance glanced over. The amount printed on the check was impossible to ignore. $2 million. Yet Richard's eyes never returned to the number. They remained fixed on the man who had presented it. Elijah Brooks stood quietly at the counter. His broad shoulders carried the weight of decades spent working land instead of sitting behind desks. Deep lines framed his face. His hands were rough, scarred by years of repairing fences, fixing tractors, and harvesting crops beneath brutal summer heat. He looked like a farmer because he was one. Nothing more. At least, that was what Richard believed. "Sir," Richard said, shaking his head as if explaining something obvious to a child, "people don't walk in off a farm and deposit checks like this." A few customers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Elijah remained silent. Richard smiled. "Do you honestly expect anyone here to believe this is legitimate?" The fluorescent lights reflected against the polished floor. Outside the massive glass windows, afternoon traffic rolled through downtown Atlanta beneath gray autumn skies. Inside, the temperature remained perfectly controlled, cool, and precise, like every other part of Richard Whitmore's world. Elijah finally spoke. "I asked for a deposit." His voice was calm, steady, not defensive, not angry. Richard found that irritating. He preferred arguments. Arguments justified decisions. Calm confidence forced him to think, and he had already decided what kind of man stood before him. "You asked for something this institution cannot process until authenticity is verified," Richard replied. "And frankly, Mr. Brooks, authenticity seems unlikely." Elijah's eyes shifted briefly toward the check, then back to Richard. "You should verify it then." Richard's smile widened. Several employees looked down at their desks. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched. Then Richard turned toward the industrial shredder located behind the service desk. The machine was normally reserved for discarded documents and outdated financial records. He walked toward it slowly, the check still in his hand. The faint motor inside the machine awakened with a low mechanical hum. For the first time, a flicker of concern crossed the teller's face. "Mr. Whitmore," she began quietly. Richard ignored her. Elijah didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't step forward. He simply watched as the machine came fully to life. The shredder's motor grew louder. Customers stared openly now. Richard positioned the edge of the $2 million check above the opening and looked directly at Elijah. "Maybe next time," he said with a satisfied smile. "Bring something more believable." Then the machine pulled the check from his fingers. The sound of shredding paper echoed through the lobby long after the machine stopped moving. Tiny strips drifted into the collection bin beneath the shredder like pale confetti, carrying away what most people in the room assumed had been a failed attempt at fraud. Richard Whitmore brushed invisible dust from his sleeve and turned back toward the counter with the confidence of a man who believed he had protected his bank from embarrassment. Across from him, Elijah Brooks remained exactly where he stood. His weathered face revealed nothing. No anger, no panic, no pleading. The silence unsettled several employees more than any argument could have. A young teller named Sarah Mitchell glanced between the farmer and the shredded remains of the document. Something felt wrong. She could not explain it. She only knew that a man who had just lost access to $2 million should not look that calm. Richard folded his hands. "I believe our business here is finished." Elijah slowly looked toward the collection bin. The overhead lights reflected softly in his dark eyes. For a moment, he seemed less interested in the destroyed check than in the decision that had destroyed it. Then he nodded once. I was hoping you would verify it first. Richard smiled. And I was hoping you would bring a believable story. A few uncomfortable chuckles came from customers nearby. Elijah did not react. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the Atlanta skyline. The afternoon sun faded behind them, dimming the light that spilled through the bank's towering windows. The lobby suddenly felt colder. Elijah reached into the pocket of his old work jacket and removed a folded envelope. The paper was creased and worn from travel. He placed it gently on the counter. Richard did not touch it. What is that? He asked. Documentation. I'm not interested. Elijah studied him quietly. That has become obvious. Richard's jaw tightened. He disliked the answer because it carried no hostility, only truth. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The bank seemed suspended in place. Computer keyboards slowed. Conversations stopped. Even customers waiting in line appeared reluctant to leave. Something about the old farmer commanded attention without demanding it. Sarah watched Elijah carefully. She noticed details Richard had ignored. The careful way he handled every piece of paper. The patience in his posture. The absence of desperation. Most people trying to deceive a bank arrived nervous. This man looked disappointed. There was a difference. Elijah rested one hand on the counter. His fingers were rough and marked by decades of labor. Every scar told a story. Summers repairing irrigation systems beneath 100-degree heat. Winters fixing broken fences before sunrise. Years spent caring for land that had belonged to his family for generations. Land that many people had once considered worthless. Land that had recently become valuable beyond imagination. Richard glanced toward the security guard. The signal was subtle but clear. The guard shifted his weight and stepped closer. Elijah noticed but remained calm. You are making this harder than it needs to be, Richard said. Sir, I drove nearly 300 miles to come here. Elijah's voice remained steady. I know exactly how far you traveled, Richard replied. And I think it is time for the drive back. Sarah looked down at her terminal, trying to hide her discomfort. Then a notification appeared on her screen. At first she assumed it was routine. A system update. An account alert. But as she read the message, her eyes widened. She checked the account number again. Then again. Her heartbeat quickened. Slowly she looked up toward Elijah Brooks. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty crossed her face. Because the name attached to the account standing in front of her was connected to numbers so large they barely seemed real. And according to the system, someone important had been trying to reach the branch for the last 20 minutes. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she stared at the account details glowing on her screen. The numbers did not make sense. At least not when paired with the man standing quietly at the counter in faded work clothes. She checked the account identification twice, then a third time. The balance remained unchanged. Several linked holdings. Multiple business transactions. Recently completed transfers worth millions of dollars. Her throat tightened. Richard was already turning away, convinced the situation was over, when Sarah finally spoke. Sir. Her voice was softer than intended. Richard barely looked at her. What is it? Sarah hesitated. Every employee in the branch had been trained to respect the chain of command. Challenging the branch manager in front of customers was never a comfortable decision. But the notification blinking across her screen refused to disappear. There is a priority message from headquarters. Richard sighed heavily. Then forward it to my office. It is marked immediate. Richard rolled his eyes. Everything is marked immediate. A few customers exchanged glances. The tension that had briefly faded returned to the room. Sarah swallowed. Sir, they have called 6 times. That finally caught his attention. Richard turned fully toward her. 6. Yes, sir. Richard frowned. Headquarters rarely called branch locations directly. And when they did, they certainly did not call repeatedly. He walked toward Sarah's station and glanced at the monitor. The moment he saw the priority designation, his expression shifted. Not fear. Not yet. But irritation mixed with confusion. He picked up the desk phone and pressed the flashing line. Richard Whitmore speaking. The lobby grew silent again. Employees pretended to work while secretly listening. Richard's posture remained confident during the first few seconds of the call. Then his shoulders stiffened. Yes. A pause. He is here. Another pause. Richard glanced toward Elijah. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty flickered behind his eyes. No, I have not processed it. Sarah noticed the color drained slightly from his face. Customers noticed too. Richard listened without speaking for nearly 30 seconds. The longer the silence lasted, the heavier the room felt. Finally he answered, I understand. Then he slowly lowered the receiver. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Elijah remained exactly where he had been from the beginning. Calm. Patient. As though he had already seen this moment coming. Richard cleared his throat. Mr. Brooks. Elijah looked at him. Yes. Richard searched for words that refused to arrive. Headquarters had not sounded concerned about the money. In fact, the money had barely been mentioned. Their questions centered on something else entirely. The envelope Elijah had placed on the counter. The documentation Richard had ignored. The reason for his visit. Richard glanced toward the folded envelope, still resting untouched. On the marble surface. You said that documentation was important. Elijah nodded. It is. Richard hesitated. Important how? Elijah's weathered hand rested lightly against the counter. Outside, thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the city skyline. Rain began tapping softly against the giant windows overlooking the street. 3 months ago, Elijah said quietly, I sold part of my family's farmland. Richard said nothing. The buyers paid well. Another pause. Too well. Several employees exchanged confused looks. Elijah continued. When I reviewed the transaction records, I found money moving through accounts that should not have been connected. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Richard stared. What exactly are you implying? Elijah's eyes shifted toward the envelope. I am not implying anything. His voice remained calm. I brought evidence. The rain intensified outside. Water streaked across the glass walls of the bank. The lobby seemed darker now, the bright confidence that had filled it earlier slowly fading. Richard looked down at the envelope again. For the first time all day, he wanted to know what was inside. And for the first time all day, he realized he might already be too late. The envelope suddenly seemed heavier than the millions of dollars everyone had been talking about. Richard stared at it without reaching for it. The rain outside intensified, drumming softly against the glass walls while gray clouds swallowed what remained of the afternoon sunlight. The bright lobby that had looked so impressive an hour earlier now felt strangely small. Elijah noticed the hesitation and gently slid the envelope forward. You should read it. Richard glanced toward Sarah, then toward the customers who had stopped pretending not to watch. His reputation had always been built on certainty. Certainty in his decisions. Certainty in his judgment. Certainty in his ability to identify risk before anyone else. Yet standing before him was a man he had dismissed within seconds, and now headquarters was calling repeatedly about evidence hidden inside a worn envelope. Richard finally picked it up. The paper felt ordinary. The consequences inside were not. He opened the flap and removed several documents. Transaction reports, transfer records, corporate ownership filings, pages covered with notes written in neat handwriting. Richard skimmed the first page, then the second. His expression tightened. By the third page, the confidence had vanished from his face entirely. Several shell companies appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Funds moved from one entity to another, then another, before eventually arriving at accounts connected to legitimate land purchases across Georgia and Alabama. On the surface, everything looked legal. Beneath the surface, it did not. Richard looked up. Where did you get these? I followed the money. Richard frowned. You are a farmer. Elijah nodded. That is true. Then how did you find all this? Elijah's eyes drifted toward the rain beyond the windows. For a moment, he seemed far away. My father used to tell me that crops and numbers have something in common. If something does not add up, eventually the land tells you. Richard blinked. The answer sounded simple, yet it carried the weight of experience. Elijah continued. After the sale, I noticed payments arriving from businesses that did not seem connected. Some addresses belonged to empty buildings. Some companies shared directors. The deeper I looked, the stranger it became. Sarah listened carefully. Every employee nearby did the same. The old farmer no longer sounded like a confused customer. He sounded like a man who had spent months assembling pieces of a puzzle nobody else had noticed. Richard returned his attention to the documents. Several account numbers printed across the pages looked familiar. Too familiar. He recognized one of the institutions involved. Then another. His stomach tightened. These transactions passed through our network? Elijah nodded once. Some of them. A heavy silence followed. Richard suddenly understood why headquarters had called. This was not about a deposit. This was not even about $2 million. If the documents were accurate, the activity described inside the envelope could attract regulators, investigators, and national attention. The branch manager slowly lowered the papers. Why bring this? Here. Elijah looked at him calmly. Because your bank was part of the trail. You could have gone directly to federal authorities. I considered it. Richard swallowed. Then why did you not? Elijah's answer came without hesitation. Because hundreds of honest people work here. His gaze briefly shifted towards Sarah and the other employees. I wanted the institution to have a chance to fix the problem before innocent people paid the price. Those words landed harder than any accusation could have. Richard felt heat rise into his face. The man he had humiliated, ignored, and dismissed had not come seeking revenge. He had come trying to help. Outside, lightning flashed silently beyond the clouds. Inside the lobby, nobody spoke. Then Sarah's computer chimed again. She glanced at the screen and her eyes widened. Slowly she looked up at Richard. Sir, she whispered. Headquarters is sending the executive vice president here right now. The announcement seemed to drain the remaining air from the room. Sarah's words hung above the quiet lobby while rain continued sliding down the towering glass windows. Nobody returned to work. Nobody looked away. The executive vice president of the entire bank was coming personally. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Right now? Richard stared at Sarah as though she had spoken another language. What did you say? Sarah swallowed. She is already on her way from headquarters. Richard felt a knot tighten in his chest. Executives did not leave headquarters in the middle of a business day unless something significant had happened. His eyes shifted toward Elijah. The old farmer remained calm, almost detached from the growing tension around him. He stood with the same quiet patience he had shown since entering the building. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The man everyone had dismissed appeared to be the only person who was not surprised by any of this. Richard looked back at the documents. Every page seemed heavier now. Every account number carried new meaning. The rain outside intensified, turning the city streets into blurred ribbons of gray and silver. 20 minutes passed slowly. Then the front doors opened. A woman in a charcoal business suit stepped inside, carrying no umbrella despite the storm. Her silver hair was neatly pulled back. Her stride was quick and purposeful. Several employees immediately recognized her. Margaret Collins, executive vice president, one of the most powerful leaders in the institution. The moment she entered, conversations died completely. Richard hurried forward. Miss Collins, I can explain. She raised a hand. Not angry, not loud, just enough to stop him. Later, her eyes moved across the room until they landed on Elijah. Something unexpected happened. Her expression softened. Not dramatically, just enough for those paying attention to notice. Margaret walked directly toward him. The polished marble floor echoed beneath her heels. Every employee watched. Richard watched most of all. When she reached Elijah, she extended her hand. Mr. Brooks. Elijah shook it. Good afternoon. I am sorry for the inconvenience you experienced today. Richard felt his stomach drop. The words landed like stones. Margaret did not apologize to customers. She did not apologize casually. Yet she was apologizing now. Personally. In front of everyone. Elijah offered a small nod. I came to help. I know, Margaret replied. Her voice carried genuine respect. Richard's confusion deepened. Margaret turned toward him. Do you know how many hours Mr. Brooks spent documenting these transactions? Richard remained silent. Over 400. Nobody moved. Margaret continued. Do you know how many financial analysts reviewed his findings before contacting me? Richard shook his head. 7. Sarah's eyes widened. Several employees exchanged stunned glances. Margaret carefully placed a hand on the envelope. For 3 months, Mr. Brooks has been working with independent auditors to trace activity connected to multiple fraudulent entities. His work identified patterns our own systems missed. Richard felt heat rise into his face. I was not aware. Margaret looked at him steadily. That is becoming increasingly clear. The rain tapped against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the city. Margaret turned back toward Elijah. The investigators confirmed. Your findings this morning. Elijah lowered his eyes briefly. Not with pride, more with relief. Then there is still time. Yes, Margaret said. Because you spoke up. The room fell silent again. Sarah suddenly understood something important. Elijah had not driven hundreds of miles to deposit a check. The money had never been the story. The check had simply been the final transaction connected to the larger pattern he had uncovered. The evidence mattered more than the funds themselves. Richard slowly looked toward the shredder sitting quietly behind the counter. The machine now seemed impossible to ignore. He remembered the confidence he had felt, the certainty, the assumptions. Every one of them looked different now. Margaret followed his gaze. Her expression hardened slightly. "Is it true?" she asked. Richard knew exactly what she meant. The question was simple. The answer was devastating. After several painful seconds, he nodded. "Yes." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Not in anger, in disappointment. And somehow that felt worse. The lobby remained silent long after Margaret's question had been answered. Outside, the storm softened into a steady curtain of rain, turning the city beyond the windows into a watercolor of gray buildings and blurred headlights. Nobody seemed eager to speak. The tension that had dominated the afternoon was gone, replaced by something heavier. Reflection. Richard stood motionless near the counter. The expensive suit that had always made him feel powerful now felt strangely unimportant. The polished marble floors, the private office upstairs, the framed awards hanging on the wall behind him suddenly seemed small compared to a simple truth he could no longer avoid. He had looked at a man and decided his worth before hearing a single word. Elijah noticed the silence and glanced toward the rain. Water traced slow paths down the glass, merging and separating before disappearing from view. It reminded him of irrigation channels on his family's land. Every stream connected to another. Every choice eventually reached somewhere. The same was true of people. Sarah quietly closed her terminal and watched the old farmer. The more she learned about him, the less extraordinary he appeared and the more remarkable he became. Not because of money, not because of the investigation, because despite everything that had happened, he showed no sign of bitterness. Margaret carefully gathered the documents and placed them back inside the envelope. "The review team will begin immediately," she said softly. Elijah nodded. "That is good. You understand what this may uncover?" Margaret asked. "I do. And you are willing to continue helping?" Elijah looked around the lobby. Employees stood frozen beside desks and counters. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked thoughtful. A few could not meet his eyes. He understood why. "Yes," he replied. "I am willing." Margaret studied him for a moment. "Most people would not be." Elijah offered a faint smile. "Most people are tired." The answer lingered in the air. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Somewhere a coffee machine hummed in the employee lounge. The ordinary sounds of life slowly returned. "My father taught me something when I was young," Elijah continued. "When a fence breaks, you can stand there blaming the storm, or you can start repairing it." Richard lowered his eyes. The words were not directed at him, yet they struck deeper than criticism ever could. Elijah had every reason to walk away, every reason to let the consequences unfold without him. Yet he remained, not because he needed the bank, not because he needed recognition, because he believed damage should be repaired if possible. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She thought about the shredded check, the assumptions, the laughter, the casual dismissal. None of it could be undone. Yet the man who had experienced it seemed more interested in protecting strangers than defending himself. The room grew quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time. Not tension, understanding. Richard slowly turned toward the large windows overlooking the rain-soaked streets. His reflection stared back at him. For years he had trusted that reflection, trusted his instincts, trusted his ability to judge character. Now he saw something else. Not evil, not cruelty, just blindness disguised as confidence. And for the first time in a very long time, that realization frightened him. Behind him, Elijah stood calmly beside the counter, hands resting lightly against the worn brim of his farm hat. The storm outside continued to fade. Small streaks of sunlight began breaking through distant clouds, casting pale gold across the wet streets below. Nobody noticed it at first. Then gradually the lobby brightened. Soft light spread across marble floors, glass walls, polished desks, and tired faces. Elijah noticed. He always noticed light. Farmers had to. And as the sunlight slowly returned to the city, he wondered whether people could do the same. 3 weeks later, the story that began inside a quiet bank branch had spread far beyond Atlanta. Investigators moved carefully through records, transactions, and corporate filings. Every day uncovered new connections. Every week revealed another layer. What surprised many people was not the size of the scheme they uncovered. It was the name attached to the discovery. Elijah Brooks. Reporters called him a whistleblower. Analysts called him unusually thorough. Investigators called him invaluable. Elijah called himself a farmer. On a cool October morning, sunlight stretched across rows of harvested fields outside his farmhouse. Dew still clung to the grass. The distant hum of a tractor echoed across the property. Elijah stood beside a wooden fence holding a mug of coffee while watching the sunrise paint the horizon gold. The land looked the same as it always had. Peaceful, honest, real. A black pickup truck slowly rolled up the gravel driveway. Elijah recognized the visitor immediately. Margaret Collins stepped out carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. Unlike the first time he had seen her, there were no rushing executives, no crowded lobby, no storm clouds hanging overhead. Just quiet countryside and open sky. Beautiful place, Margaret said as she approached. Elijah smiled faintly. My father thought so. They walked toward the porch together. The wood creaked softly beneath their feet. Margaret handed him a folder. The review is complete. Elijah studied her face. And everything you found was accurate. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh earth across the property. Margaret sat in one of the old wooden chairs overlooking the fields. Do you know what surprised investigators most? Elijah shook his head. The timeline. She opened the folder. Most people would have stopped after discovering the first irregularity. You spent months following every lead. Elijah looked toward the fields. If you stop halfway through repairing a fence, the cattle still get out. Margaret laughed quietly. Then her expression softened. You saved this institution from a disaster. Elijah remained silent. The words did not seem to affect him. Margaret noticed. You really never cared about recognition, did you? Recognition does not help crops grow. The answer made her smile. For a moment, they sat listening to wind moving through distant trees. Then Margaret reached into the folder and removed another document. There is something else. Elijah glanced down. It was an official letter from the board of directors. The board voted unanimously. Margaret paused. They want to establish a new financial integrity initiative using your research methods as a model. Elijah looked genuinely surprised. Mine. Yours. Margaret nodded. Your approach identified patterns sophisticated software missed. Elijah stared at the letter. Not because of pride. Because of the irony. A man who had spent most of his life being underestimated had quietly taught experts something new. Margaret watched him carefully. There is another reason I came. Elijah folded the letter and placed it beside him. What is that? Margaret hesitated. Richard Whitmore resigned yesterday. The breeze seemed to pause. Elijah looked out across the fields without speaking. I thought you should know. Several seconds passed. Did he ask you to tell me? Margaret nodded once. He did. Elijah lowered his eyes. The sunlight reflected softly across the weathered wood of the porch. Then he is still carrying it. Carrying what? Margaret asked. Elijah looked toward the horizon, where rows of farmland stretched beneath the morning sky. The moment he stopped seeing a person and started seeing an assumption. Neither of them spoke after that. The wind moved gently across the fields. Somewhere in the distance, birds lifted from a tree line and disappeared into the brightening sky. And for the first time since the investigation began, Elijah felt something unexpected. Not victory, not satisfaction, something quieter. Hope. 2 days after Margaret's visit, a dark sedan rolled slowly down the gravel road leading to Elijah's farmhouse. The afternoon sun hung low above the fields, washing the countryside in warm amber light. Harvest season had painted the landscape in shades of gold and copper. Elijah was repairing a section of fence near the edge of his property when he noticed the vehicle approaching. He did not recognize it at first. Then the driver stepped out. Richard Whitmore looked different without the tailored confidence that had once seemed stitched into every suit he wore. He was still neatly dressed, but something had changed. His shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with work. For a moment, neither man spoke. The breeze moved gently across the fields, carrying the scent of cut hay and fresh earth. Richard removed his hands from his pockets and looked around at the property. You have a beautiful farm, he said quietly. Elijah rested both hands on the wooden fence post. My father spent his whole life building it. Richard nodded. The words seemed to make the silence heavier. Margaret told me where to find you. Elijah said nothing. Richard looked down at the dirt beneath his shoes. The same kind of dirt he once would have seen as evidence of someone being less important than himself. Now it simply looked like soil. Honest soil. "I owe you an apology," he finally said. Elijah studied him calmly. "For the check?" Richard shook his head. "No," his voice grew quieter. "For deciding who you were before I knew anything about you." The wind moved through the nearby trees. Leaves rustled softly above them. Richard continued, "I keep replaying that day in my head. Not because of what happened to my career. Because of what it revealed about me." Elijah listened without interruption. "I spent years believing I could judge people quickly," Richard said. "I called it experience. I called it instinct. The truth is, sometimes it was arrogance." The confession seemed to cost him something. Elijah could see it. Richard was not defending himself. He was confronting himself. There was a difference. "When I saw you walk into that bank," Richard continued, "I noticed your clothes before your words. Your boots before your character. I saw a stereotype instead of a human being." The late afternoon sunlight reflected across the fields behind Elijah. Somewhere in the distance a tractor engine hummed. Life continued moving exactly as it always had. Richard reached into his jacket and removed a small envelope. "This belongs to you." Elijah opened it. Inside was a cashier's check replacing the one that had been destroyed, along with a handwritten letter. Elijah looked up. "You did not have to do this." "Yes," Richard replied. "I did." Another silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Honest. Richard looked toward the horizon. "You know what bothers me most?" Elijah waited. "You were trying to help people. Even after everything. Even after the way I treated you." Elijah folded the envelope carefully. "My father used to tell me something." Richard looked at him. "What was that?" Elijah smiled faintly. "If someone gets lost on your land, you do not point them in the wrong direction just because they were rude." Richard laughed softly for the first time. Then his eyes grew wet. Not from sadness. From relief. Relief that forgiveness was still possible. Elijah extended his hand. Richard looked surprised. Then he shook it. The gesture lasted only a moment, but it carried more weight than any speech. In that handshake, there was no banker and no farmer. No executive and no customer. No status. No assumptions. Just two men standing beneath an open sky, learning that respect should have been there from the beginning. Winter arrived quietly across southern Georgia. The fields rested beneath pale morning skies, waiting for another season. Frost clung to fence posts before sunrise and disappeared beneath the warmth of afternoon light. Life on the farm settled back into familiar rhythms. Tractors started before dawn. Gates needed repairing. Soil needed tending. To most people, the story had ended months ago. Newspapers moved on. Television crews stopped calling. New headlines replaced old ones. But some changes remained long after public attention faded. Inside the headquarters of the bank, a framed plaque now hung near the entrance of the Financial Integrity Division. It did not contain a photograph. It did not celebrate profits or awards. It carried a simple inscription about honesty, diligence, and the responsibility to see people clearly. Employees passed it every day. Many knew exactly why it was there. Sarah Mitchell knew. She had accepted a position with the new oversight team created after the investigation. Whenever new employees joined, she told them the same thing. Numbers mattered. Procedures mattered. But people mattered first. Several states away, regulators continued using methods inspired by the work that began at a farmhouse kitchen table. Patterns were identified sooner. Problems were addressed faster. Quiet improvements spread through systems that most people would never see. Elijah rarely thought about any of that. On most mornings, he was more concerned with weather forecasts than recognition. One cold afternoon, he stood beside a fence line watching sunlight drift across acres of farmland. The fields looked almost silver beneath the winter sky. In the distance, a pickup truck moved slowly along a neighboring property. Smoke rose from a chimney several hundred yards away. The world felt peaceful. His phone vibrated softly in his jacket pocket. It was a message from Richard. Not about business. Not about banks. A simple photograph. A community garden project that Richard had begun helping with after leaving his executive career behind. Children stood smiling beside newly built planting beds. Elijah looked at the picture and smiled faintly. People could change. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes painfully. But they could change. He sent a short reply. "Looks good. Make sure they water the tomatoes." A moment later, another message arrived. "Thank you. Elijah slipped the phone back into his pocket. The wind moved gently across the land. Above him, a flock of birds crossed the pale horizon. Their shadows drifted briefly across the fields before disappearing. He thought about his father, about lessons learned long before anyone cared about investigations or financial records. Character revealed itself when nobody was watching. Kindness mattered most when it was hardest to offer. And respect should never depend on clothing, status, titles, or assumptions. The sun slowly lowered toward the horizon. Golden light spilled across the farmland, stretching long shadows over rows of resting soil. Elijah stood quietly beside the fence. No speeches followed. No crowds appeared. No dramatic celebration arrived. Just wind moving through dry grass. Just fading sunlight reflecting across open fields. Just a man who had chosen integrity when bitterness would have been easier. As evening settled over the countryside, the last light touched the weathered wood of the fence, the distant trees, and the brim of Elijah's old farm hat. Then the sun slipped below the horizon. The fields grew still. The sky softened into shades of blue and gold. And in that quiet moment, there was nothing left to prove. Only the simple, enduring peace that comes when a person chooses dignity over pride, kindness over resentment, and truth over judgment.